Welcome to Occult Archives, where we unearth books.
Books?
Yeah, from mystical grimoires and ancient religious texts.
Right.
These books carry secrets too dangerous to be read. Season 1, Episode 52, The Superstitions of Witchcraft. A deep dive into the shadowed corners of belief, Dæmonologie, King James, and the witch hunter's mind.
So in this deep dive, we're not just like skimming the surface of witchcraft. We're going to plunge straight into like a specific historical document to really understand what people actually believed back then.
That's right. Forget all the like pop culture images of witches that you have in your head for just a second, because we've got some pretty remarkable primary source material for you today.
Okay.
Our main focus is Dæmonologie, written by King James I of England back in 1597.
Wow.
When he was still James VI of Scotland.
Right.
And just to give you even richer context, we're also going to be looking at news from Scotland, which is a really compelling account from 1591 detailing a witch trial that the king himself was like deeply involved in. Yeah. And both of these texts come to us through G.B. Harrison's edited collection, the Bodley Head Quarto series.
What makes these texts so powerful is King James's like personal involvement. From the preface of Dæmonologie, he leaves no room for doubt. He states, quote, "The assaults of Satan are most certainly practiced, and that the instruments thereof merit most severely to be punished."
Right, and it wasn't just some academic exercise for him. This was like a matter of personal belief and royal duty.
Absolutely, and news from Scotland really brings that conviction to life. You see him actively participating in the trial. And one thing that really stands out to me is the confession of Agnes Sampson.
Oh, yeah.
She apparently recounted private conversations that he had with his queen on their wedding night in Norway.
Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Even the editor of these texts says that such a revelation would solidify anyone's deepest fears about like hidden malevolent forces at work.
Absolutely. So today, for our deep dive, our mission is to thoroughly explore all the superstitions and beliefs about witchcraft as they're laid out in these documents.
Yeah, we want to help you understand what these, quote, darker beliefs of our ancestors were, specifically through the lens of King James.
Yes.
And his direct experiences.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember we're not endorsing any of these beliefs.
Right.
We're just trying to understand them within their historical context.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit.
All right.
Starting with Dæmonologie itself.
Dæmonologie is structured as a dialogue.
Okay.
So you have Philomathes, who's like seeking knowledge, and then you have Epistemon, who embodies the expert voice of King James.
Okay, so you have the seeker and the expert laying out his arguments and beliefs.
Right. One of the first things that becomes clear to me is why he felt compelled to write this in the first place.
Yeah.
He explicitly states his purpose, to refute those who were skeptical about the existence and power of witchcraft. He specifically names Scott and Waris.
Right.
And to argue for the severe punishment of anyone found practicing it.
Yeah, he's not mincing words.
No, he's not. And very early on, the dialogue kind of dives into how these unlawful arts were categorized. And there's a distinction between magie or necromancy and sorcery or witchcraft.
Okay, so what are the key differences that he highlights between those two?
The motivations behind these practices are quite distinct. Curiosity, a thirst for forbidden knowledge, is seen as the primary driving force behind magie or necromancy.
Okay.
It's like a dangerous intellectual pursuit. Sorcery, on the other hand, is linked to more base and earthly desires, like seeking revenge or having a greedy desire for wealth and possessions.
Okay, so you have like the intellectual, perhaps even scholarly motivation?
Yeah.
Versus the more like grounded and often malicious motivation. Okay, that's a fascinating distinction.
And the individuals involved are also seen as distinct. So witches are essentially seen as servants or slaves to the devil, carrying out his will. Whereas necromancers are more like his masters or commanders.
Oh, commanders.
Yeah.
That sounds a little odd to me.
He does.
How could someone in league with the devil possibly be in command of him?
Well, it's not about any real inherent power that they hold over the devil.
Okay.
Instead, it's described as secundum quid, which means based on a contract or agreement.
Okay.
So the devil obligates himself to perform certain, often trivial services in exchange for what he ultimately desires, the practitioner's body and soul.
Right. It's a very unequal and foolish bargain.
It is a very unequal bargain.
Yeah. So how does someone get involved in magi or necromancy in the first place?
What pathways?
Yeah, what pathways does James outline?
He describes what he calls the devil's school and his rudiments.
Okay.
So the school is primarily aimed at those who are learned, individuals who have achieved intellectual prowess, but perhaps lack a strong spiritual foundation.
Okay.
Judicial astrology, the practice of predicting the future through the stars,
Right.
is presented as a significant gateway here.
Okay.
You know, these individuals, finding natural knowledge insufficient,
Yeah.
try to delve into these forbidden areas.
Mm-hmm.
The initial principles seem rooted in natural observations, so they're easily lured in.
Yeah.
And then when some predictions happen to come true,
Right.
they're tempted to go further and further,
Yeah.
eventually seeking the forbidden knowledge of magi,
Right.
when lawful sciences fail to satisfy their curiosity.
Right. So it's a kind of intellectual pride or overreach that opens the door to these darker practices.
Exactly.
And the rudiments.
Yeah, the rudiments are aimed at those who are unlearned.
Okay.
This encompasses what we might think of as folk magic.
Okay.
Charms using specific words, herbs, and stones believed to have power without any natural or logical explanation.
So like those daft wives
Yes, exactly.
using knotted threads or particular herbs to try and heal livestock or stop bleeding.
Precisely. And James argues that when these practices appear to work, through the devil's deception, of course,
Right.
it can lead the unlearned, driven by a desire for reputation or personal gain,
Yeah.
to either seek out more experienced practitioners
Right.
or even directly attempt to make a pact with the devil themselves.
It's quite striking how he frames even those seemingly harmless folk remedies as potential first steps down a very dangerous path.
It is, and the devil's offerings
Yeah.
are tailored to the magician's desires.
Mm-hmm.
He might appear in specific forms, perhaps as a particular animal, or simply as a disembodied voice.
Right.
He promises to perform various services,
Okay.
delivering news from distant lands with supernatural speed,
Uh-huh.
revealing the hidden secrets of other people,
Mm-hmm.
as long as those secrets have been spoken aloud,
Okay.
providing exotic and luxurious foods,
Mhm.
and even creating elaborate illusions of grand armies or other impressive sights.
Illusions, always illusions.
It's never anything truly created or of substance.
Right. And I imagine James has some very strong theological arguments against the lawfulness of engaging in magic.
Oh, absolutely. He invokes a key theological axiom.
Okay.
Nunquam faciendum est malum ut bonum inde eveniat.
Okay.
Evil should never be done so that good may come of it,
Mm.
even if a magician genuinely believes they can achieve some positive outcome through their dealings with the devil.
Right.
The very act of making that pact and
Yeah.
engaging with demonic forces renders it inherently and irrevocably unlawful in his eyes.
Okay, so that gives us a good understanding of magi and necromancy as presented in Dæmonologie.
Right.
Now let's move on to sorcery and witchcraft.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that while many people talk about it, James believes few truly understand it.
Yes, and he immediately addresses the skepticism surrounding witchcraft that existed even in his time. Some people argued that the biblical examples often used to support the existence of witchcraft actually referred only to magicians and necromancers, not to the kind of witches that were being accused in contemporary trials. Others claimed that those who confessed to witchcraft were simply suffering from melancholy, a kind of deep depression, and that their confessions were merely products of their troubled mental state.
And how does James counter those arguments?
Well, he refutes the idea that Scripture only speaks of magicians, asserting that there are clear examples within the Bible of what we would readily understand as witchcraft,
Okay.
instances of people using supernatural means to cause harm.
Oh, all right.
As for the argument about melancholy, he points out that many accused witches simply don't fit the stereotypical profile of someone suffering from deep depression.
Right.
Some are wealthy, worldly, and seem to thoroughly enjoy earthly pleasures. Hardly the typical symptoms of melancholy. Furthermore, he astutely notes that witches are often very reluctant to confess their supposed crimes until they are subjected to torture,
Right.
which he takes as a sign of genuine guilt,
Yeah.
unlike those suffering from melancholy, who might freely talk about their imagined wrongdoing.
Okay, so he's essentially saying that the sheer number of confessions, even if extracted under duress, and the very real harm that was being attributed to witchcraft were evidence enough to dismiss those skeptical viewpoints.
Precisely.
Okay.
He then delves into the etymology of the terms.
Okay.
explaining that sorcery comes from the Latin word for casting lots,
Mm.
while witchcraft is simply the common name for it in their own language.
Right.
He then draws an interesting parallel to the earlier division of necromancers
Okay.
into the learned and unlearned
Mm.
by categorizing witches into the rich and respected
Okay.
and the poor and base.
Okay.
Again, aligning these categories with the primary motivations of seeking revenge for the former and pursuing riches for the latter.
Interesting parallels.
Indeed.
What about the initiation process for witches?
Okay.
How does one become a servant of the devil in this framework?
James describes a very specific sequence of events.
Okay.
The devil actively seeks an entrance.
An entrance.
Yes, an opening or vulnerability in potential recruits.
Mm-hmm.
He typically finds this in individuals marked by profound ignorance and a wicked lifestyle,
Okay.
or in those whose careless disregard for God has led them to utter despair.
Mm-hmm.
He then subtly and patiently feeds their despair
Yeah.
until the opportune moment arrives for him to reveal himself,
Okay.
either through a disembodied voice or in a seemingly human form.
Right.
He inquires about their troubles and promises a swift and effective remedy if they are willing to follow his counsel.
Right. Classic predatory tactic.
Exactly.
Promise relief and power to those who are feeling most vulnerable
Precisely.
and hopeless.
Following this initial contact, they have a second meeting where the devil attempts to persuade them to dedicate themselves entirely to his service. This involves a formal renunciation of God and the sacrament of baptism in return for their allegiance.
Right.
He bestows upon them his mark on a secret part of their body.
Okay.
This mark is described as initially causing pain,
Yeah.
but then becoming permanently insensitive to touch,
Mm-hmm.
serving as tangible proof of the devil's power over them.
It's like a brand.
It is like a brand.
Okay.
The lingering discomfort also acts as a constant reminder
Right.
until their next meeting, preventing them from easily forgetting their pact or attempting to go back on their word.
Okay. And then at the third crucial meeting,
Yes, at the third meeting,
what happens?
he supposedly teaches them the specific methods they will use
Mm-hmm.
to achieve their desires.
Okay.
Revenge for those who feel wronged,
Yeah.
wealth and material gain for others,
Right.
always through vile and unlawful means.
So once they have been initiated in this way, what kind of actions are these wishes believed to be capable of?
James divides their actions into two main categories.
Oh.
Those concerning their own persons and those that are directed outward towards others
Okay.
regarding their own persons.
Yeah.
He returns to the idea of the devil as God's ape,
Mm-hmm.
constantly mimicking and perverting divine worship.
Right.
Just as Christians gather together in congregations to serve and worship God,
Mm-hmm.
witches are believed to convene in large numbers secretly, of course,
Right.
to serve and pay homage to Satan.
Yep.
They are marked with the devil's seal,
Mm-hmm.
just as Christians are marked by baptism.
Right.
The devil himself supposedly teaches them the methods for working their evil magic
Okay.
and demands a regular accounting of their wicked deeds.
So like a performance review.
Yeah, like a performance review.
Okay.
James even suggests that they sometimes convene in actual churches,
Oh, wow.
defiling sacred spaces,
Huh?
and that their form of adoration grotesquely involves kissing the devil's hindquarters.
Oh, that's a particularly vivid and, frankly, quite unsettling detail.
It is a very unsettling detail.
Yeah. So what about their actions directed towards other people?
Their actions towards others are primarily driven by those initial motivations that drew them to witchcraft in the first place,
Okay.
to inflict harm on people and their possessions
Right.
as revenge for perceived injustices, or to cause misfortune and suffering for personal gain.
Okay.
James details a variety of methods they supposedly employ.
Okay.
For what he considers minor acts of malice,
Uh-huh.
the devil might instruct them to utilize dead bodies and mix various powders and concoctions
Right,
for
yeah.
causing more significant harm.
Yeah.
He mentions the practice of making wax or clay figures that, when subjected to heat like roasting over a fire,
Mm-hmm.
cause the intended victim to gradually waste away and sicken.
Like a voodoo doll.
Exactly
Yep.
like a voodoo doll. He also discusses the use of specific stones or powders that can either inflict diseases or conversely offer cures,
Okay.
and the existence of unusual poisons unknown to conventional physicians,
Right.
which he attributes to the devil's superior knowledge of the hidden properties within nature.
But he does clarify that these physical objects,
Yes.
the wax, figures the powders, They don't possess any inherent magical power themselves, right?
Exactly.
They're more symbolic in nature.
Precisely. James explains that these outward means are merely superficial displays,
Okay.
mimicking the way in which God can work profound heavenly effects through earthly sacraments,
Right.
or how Christ healed the blind man by using clay and spittle,
Right.
even though the physical substances themselves had no intrinsic healing power.
So it's ultimately the devil's power working through these symbolic acts and objects.
Precisely.
Okay. What specific kinds of harm are these witches believed to be capable of inflicting on others?
He lists a considerable range, causing love or hatred to arise between individuals by manipulating corrupted human affections,
Right.
transferring sickness and disease from one person to another, inflicting death by the bewitching and subsequent roasting of effigies,
Okay.
which supposedly weakens the victim's spirits of life,
Okay.
raising sudden and localized storms and tempests in specific areas,
Okay.
distinguishable, he claims, from natural storms by their abruptness and short duration.
Right.
Inducing fits of madness or frenzy in individuals, attributing what might be natural illnesses to demonic influence,
Right.
causing malevolent spirits to haunt and trouble people,
Okay.
or specific houses,
Right.
leading to poltergeist-like activity and even full-blown demonic possession.
That's quite an extensive and terrifying catalog of potential harms.
It is a very extensive catalog.
And there's a point in Dæmonologie where James addresses the seemingly disproportionate number of women believed to be involved in witchcraft compared to men.
Yes.
What's his reasoning for this?
His reasoning, unfortunately, is deeply rooted in the prevalent misogynistic views of the time.
Oh.
He asserts that women are inherently the frailer sex, both physically and mentally,
Right.
and therefore are significantly easier for the devil to ensnare in his gross snares.
Okay.
Drawing a direct and, of course, highly problematic analogy to
Right.
the serpent deceiving Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Right.
He goes on to say that this supposed inherent weakness makes the devil the homelier with that sex sensing,
Right.
meaning more familiar and comfortable in dealing with women.
A deeply troubling and, as you point out, utterly baseless justification.
Absolutely.
He also touches on the limitations of the devil's power in all of this, doesn't he?
He does.
It's not as though the devil can just do whatever he pleases.
No, you're absolutely right.
According to James.
He emphasizes that the devil's power to inflict harm is ultimately granted by God's permission and serves a variety of divine purposes.
Okay, look away.
These purposes include punishing the wicked for their transgressions, jolting the godly out of their sinful ways,
Right.
and prompting them to repentance,
Okay.
and testing the patience and fortitude of the righteous,
Okay.
much like the biblical figure of Job.
And what about the idea of seeking help or a cure from other individuals suspected of witchcraft,
Yes.
if you believe you've been harmed by it? Is that considered an acceptable course of action
Absolutely not.
within this belief system?
James firmly reiterates that theological axiom we discussed earlier,
Right.
Nunquam faciendum est malum ut bonum in Dei veniat.
Right.
Seeking a cure from another witch necessarily involves dealing with the devil's instruments and engaging with demonic forces, which is inherently evil in his view.
So what then is the lawful and acceptable way to seek a cure if you believe you've been targeted by witchcraft?
The only lawful and truly effective remedies are earnest and sincere prayer directed to God,
Okay.
a genuine and demonstrable amendment of one's sinful life,
Okay.
and the vigorous prosecution of accused witches by the authorities.
Right.
He views their punishment by death as a kind of salutary sacrifice for the patient,
Oh, wow.
a necessary act to cleanse the community of evil.
He also considers who might be most vulnerable to the effects of witchcraft, doesn't he?
He does.
Are some people seen as more susceptible than others?
Yes. He believes that those individuals who possess a weak or wavering faith are the most susceptible to the attacks and influence of witchcraft,
Okay.
as faith is presented as the most potent defense against such dark forces.
Right.
Conversely, he argues that those who are zealous in their persecution of witches have very little to fear from their supposed powers.
Almost a kind of divine immunity.
Yes, almost a divine immunity.
For those actively engaged in fighting against witchcraft.
Precisely.
What about the devil's interactions with witches who have been imprisoned and are awaiting trial?
Yes.
Does he simply abandon them to their fate?
Not entirely, according to James.
Okay.
He suggests that the devil's behavior towards imprisoned witches depends heavily on the witch's state of mind.
Okay.
If they remain stubbornly defiant, and continue to deny their involvement in witchcraft,
Right.
he will persist in offering them false hope of escape or acquittal, or conversely attempt to deepen their despair,
Right.
even tempting them to take their own lives.
Right.
However, if a witch becomes truly penitent, confesses their sins, and seeks forgiveness, James believes that God will no longer permit the devil to trouble them with his presence, temptations, and false promises.
So the devil is consistently portrayed as a master manipulator,
Absolutely.
always seeking to exploit the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of individuals, even when they are behind bars.
Exactly.
And does James believe that the devil can appear visibly to people who are not necessarily his sworn followers or involved in witchcraft?
He acknowledges that while the coming of Christ and the subsequent spread of the gospel throughout the world significantly diminished the more overt and widespread forms of demonic influence that were prevalent in pagan times, such as the direct communication through oracles, it didn't entirely stop the devil from occasionally appearing in a visible form. He draws a distinction between two primary forms of the devil's visible interactions on earth. The first, the outward troubling or full demonic possession of Christians, became considerably rarer after the advent of Christ. The second form, however, which operates through unlawful arts like witchcraft, became, in his view, increasingly common. He even makes a rather interesting claim, suggesting that during the era he refers to as blind papistry, numerous sightings of ghosts and other spirits were frequently reported, whereas the practice of unlawful arts was less widespread. Now, he argues, the situation has somewhat reversed.
So in his perspective, the focus of demonic activity has shifted towards these more insidious and human-mediated practices of witchcraft.
Precisely.
And he concludes demonology by directly addressing those who deny the very existence or power of the devil altogether, right?
Yes, he equates denying the devil's power with nothing less than denying God's power itself.
Wow.
Labeling it a fundamental error akin to the heresy of the Sadducees in biblical times. He argues that understanding the nature and tactics of the devil as God's direct adversary actually helps us to better comprehend the immense power and glory of God. By stark contrast, he expresses his concern that there are far too many Sadducees in the world who casually dismiss the existence of spirits and the reality of demonic influence. And he believes that God occasionally permits spirits to appear visibly in order to directly counter this dangerous error of disbelief.
That gives us a really comprehensive overview of the complex and often disturbing beliefs laid out in King James's Demonology.
Yes.
Now let's turn our attention to news from Scotland. And this particularly notorious case that King James himself was so deeply involved in.
News from Scotland presents itself as a completely truthful account, explicitly aiming to correct the manifold untruths and sensationalized stories that were already circulating about this very recent witch trial. It specifically refutes a popular, but according to this author, entirely fabricated story involving a traveling peddler who supposedly discovered the coven of witches through miraculous intervention. The author is at pains to emphasize that what follows is the true discourse of the actual events as they unfolded.
So according to this true discourse, what actually happened?
How was this supposed coven of witches initially uncovered and brought to light? The account centers on a young maidservant named Galiston Kane, who resided in the town of Trennant. She began to secretly leave her master's house late at night and started performing what were perceived by the community as miraculous healings of the sick. Because these apparent abilities seemed to manifest suddenly and without any natural explanation. Her master, a man named David Seaton, grew increasingly suspicious, fearing that she was employing unlawful and supernatural means. He initially interrogated her, but when she refused to answer his questions, he resorted to increasingly brutal methods of torture, including using pillywinks on her fingers to crush them, and twisting her head with a rope in a particularly agonizing manner.
That's horrible.
It is a horrible image. Despite this intense physical anguish, she continued to confess nothing until they discovered what was believed to be the enemy's mark on her throat.
The enemy's mark?
Yes.
Like the devil's mark?
Yes, the devil's mark.
Okay.
Once this mark was found, she finally confessed that her actions were indeed due to the devil's allurements.
Right.
And that she had been practicing witchcraft.
And once she finally confessed under torture, did she implicate other individuals?
Yes, almost immediately upon confessing herself, she
Yeah.
began to accuse several other individuals within the community
Mm-hmm.
of being notorious witches,
Right.
leading directly to their apprehension and further interrogation.
Okay. And who were some of the key figures that she named?
Key figures who were named by her included Agnes Sampson,
Okay.
who was described as the eldest and perhaps most influential witch within the coven,
Mm-hmm.
Agnes Thompson, a woman from Edinburgh,
Okay.
and a particularly interesting character named Dr. Fian,
Dr. Fia.
also known as John Cunningham,
Okay.
who was a schoolmaster in the town of Saltpans
Okay.
and was allegedly the register to the devil,
Register to the devil.
keeping records of their demonic pacts and activities.
That's an intriguing title. Register to the devil.
It is.
It suggests a more organized and perhaps even bureaucratic structure within this supposed demonic organization.
It does imply it.
And the account goes on to detail the specific examinations and interrogations of these individuals.
It does.
So what happened with Agnes Sampson?
Agnes Sampson, the elder witch, was brought before King James himself
Okay.
and his assembled nobility at Hillesud House. Initially, despite the king's own attempts to persuade her to confess, she vehemently denied all the accusations leveled against her. She was then taken to prison and subjected to the same brutal methods of torture that Gellis Duncan had endured.
Right.
Following the widespread belief that the devil marked his followers in a secret and often hidden place on their body.
Right. Traditionally thought to be under the hair.
Yes, traditionally thought to be under the hair.
Yeah.
By licking them, Agnes Sampson had all of her hair shaved off.
Oh, wow.
And her head was twisted with a rope for nearly an hour in a relentless effort to break her resistance.
That's awful.
It is a horrible image.
Yeah.
She only finally confessed to the charges after the devil's mark was reportedly discovered on her privates.
A truly gruesome and horrifying practice.
It is a very disturbing practice.
And once this mark was supposedly found, she confessed to everything, including implicating even more people.
She did.
What about Agnes Thompson?
Agnes Thompson confessed to attending a large gathering or coven meeting of approximately 200 witches.
Wow.
On All Hallow, even what we now know as Halloween.
Right.
At the Kirk of North Berwick in Lothian. Okay.
She claimed that they traveled to this meeting by sea in a rather fantastical and improbable manner.
Okay.
Using riddles or sieves as makeshift boats.
Sieves as boats?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that they merrily drank wine throughout their journey.
Oh, wow.
Upon landing near the kirk, they reportedly danced a wild dance called a rail.
Okay.
And sang a very specific and somewhat nonsensical song.
Okay.
Comer go ye before comer go ye, gif ye will not go before comer let me.
Okay.
She even identified Gellis Duncan as the one who played the tune for their dance on a Jew's trump.
Okay. A Jew's trump.
A type of mouth harp.
Sieves functioning as boats. That's a rather surreal and fantastical image.
It is a very surreal image.
What about the devil's presence at this large gathering?
Did Agnes Thompson describe him, according to Agnes Thompson's?